All right, we're back to our series on prayer. This is week 5, which is practical obstacles in prayer. So we've heard a few different things about prayer up to this point, and this time it's kind of a little bit more nuts and bolts. So hopefully you can follow along and get some good thoughts about the practical aspects of prayer. So first of all, we kind of think about prayer in terms of the head, and in this case, we're trying to say, well, I think most of us know a lot about prayer. We've heard a lot about prayer. We know it's important. We may even know what Jesus says, even chapter and verse about what Jesus says about prayer, and we still struggle. And so we want to talk a little bit about what those struggles might be when it relates to the heart and the hands when we actually go into prayer and struggle even there. So let's just take a quick look at a few things here. So one passage that is really informative when we think about prayer, particularly around struggling with unanswered prayer. Maybe you've spent a lot of time in prayer around a particular issue, and it just seems like those prayers can run up against a wall, and they're just not heard. Nothing is changing. Your heart's not changing, and the situation isn't changing. And there's some words from James that maybe can be helpful. They might even sound a little bit tough. James tends to word things a little bit strongly. And so let's just take a look at this. This is from chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source of your pleasures that wage war against your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. So this is pretty strong language from James, but let's just piece this out a little bit. So one of the things that we see here, and if we go right to the heart of it, is when we ask and don't receive, there's usually a reason for that. One is it might not be God's time, right? God has His own timing. He works off his own calendar, His own time frame, and that usually does not line up with our own. But the other is that our heart can be very deceitful and wicked and have its own agenda in asking for whatever it is we're asking for. And so not having correct motives when we go to the Lord and not being in the right place in our heart when we're asking for things, it may just be that we're asking for things that do not line up with God's will whatsoever. And so this leads us into one of the, if not the core problem with our prayer as it relates to the heart, is just sin. And when we think about sin in our heart and the way that it influences our prayers, it is probably the biggest problem, but it may also be the easiest to wrap our minds around as far as the solution goes, right? We come right to the gospel and say the Lord paid for our sin, and if we're willing to confess it and can enter into a place of confession in our heart and then accept the forgiveness that Jesus paid for on the cross, then we are able to go into prayer through confession with a different heart, with a different attitude, having dealt with our sin in an ultimate way. And so again, sin is probably our biggest barrier to entering into prayer that God can respond to, that He can where our will lines up with His in such a way that that it's safe for Him to answer our prayers, because it's a prayer that lines up with His timetable and His desires. So another big obstacle to to prayer is suffering, and it is difficult. It is very difficult when we are in a place of suffering to see sin as something that is effectual, right? That actually accomplishes something. We're so immersed in our pain and our struggles and our fight against whatever situation or circumstance or feeling or thoughts, that it's difficult to see past it. We get lost in the woods, and it's very difficult to understand the purpose, which again, being able to come to prayer through a confession of sin, through an understanding of our own heart and how we respond to suffering, can be extremely helpful in entering into a place of suffering with the Lord, that He is not unaware of what it is to suffer at all, right? He's the one who suffered the worst penalty. And so being able to identify with Him in our suffering can help us kind of move past that place of being lost in suffering to being guided in our suffering, and which then informs our prayers and allows us again to line up with what God is trying to accomplish through suffering and what He has accomplished through suffering. So then we come to another place that can be a big obstacle, and that's just doubt. Maybe again our head says, yes, I understand about prayer, that if my prayers line up with God's will and His desires, and I've come with a clean heart and confession, I still may just doubt that He even wants to answer my prayers, or that He's listening at all, or maybe it's deeper than that, that we really believe that we are not worthy of the forgiveness that He's paid for, that we are somehow the exception to the rule. And so we, though we may believe these things or know these things, they haven't really sunk deep into our hearts to bring about that heart change that's necessary to kind of, not that we will never doubt, but that we will be able to kind of move past that doubt and in faith accept that these things are actually true for me and for you. Another big issue which comes back around to sin, which again is important to come into prayer through a path of confession, is our guilt and our shame for things that we have done or that we're doing, that we're actively engaged in. And it is important that we recognize that the shame and guilt of our sin was covered in that forgiveness. It wasn't just you are forgiven of your sin, but you're going to have to live with your guilt and shame. That's not true. And this may actually be more of a head thing that we have to wrap our mind around. But it is this place of being able to truly understand our guilt and shame and not just dismiss it as invalid. It's important that we have those feelings, that guilt and shame can be powerful motivators. But shame itself can be extremely destructive if we stay in that place. They can be informative, they can be helpful, and it's important to feel those things, but feel them with a movement towards giving those over to Jesus. And again, recognizing that He has covered all of that in His blood and in His purchase of us and adoption of us into His eternal family.